My name is Laura-Irina and I'm a second-year student at Tech School of Business. I'm also a CDS fellow, and I am happy to be here today with Tony Salvador, who is a senior principal engineer in the corporate strategy office at Intel Corporation. Thank you, Tony, for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start off with an easy question. Could you please talk a little bit about your job and your role at Intel, and how are you thinking about hyperconnectivity in the world?
Okay, well, I'm in the corporate strategy office, so I work with some colleagues to think about questions that are of broad interest across the company and across the different business units. Before doing that, I've been in the research labs and in different product groups, and I'm a social scientist. So I, with various times with different teams of social scientists, think about what are the implications of technology as it go out into the world, where are there opportunities for the company and for the industry, and what is meaningful to people, how are people actually using these technologies to create value and meaning in their lives.
So how does hyperconnectivity change the way you operate and your business model?
So it's interesting. So if I understand hyperconnectivity, it's the notion that people are connected to each other and to different devices, and devices are connected to each other in ways that they haven't ever been in the past, right? That creates an interesting proposition, because if everybody can be theoretically connected to every other person on the planet at any point, then that means that we're thinking less about linear systems and much more about network systems. And networks propagate differentially. So there's people who've made different laws about this, and Metcalfe and Reed, and they actually argue about different exponents. But the idea is that the value of a network can actually propagate exponentially through the size of the network. And there's a certain amount of serendipity that actually occurs, where people can actually find each other and form these different value networks at any point in time. That changes the nature of business, we argue. It changes the nature of business from being punctuated moments of volatility over relative stability to what we think is prolonged periods of volatility with punctuated stability. That changes the way we actually do business. All of the tools that we have, all of our marketing tools, all our research tools are all based on relative stability with actually limited amounts of volatility. But if you actually swap that, if you change that around, then we think the marketing tools have to change. We think the business tools have to change to account for that. And as they change, we need to be able to think about new ways of creating value and of actually harvesting value, if you will, within the industry, using these new kinds of tools and thinking through networks. And so the business models change fundamentally by thinking through networks as opposed to thinking through linear chains.
Switching gears, what technology trends do you think will make the fundamental impact in business in the next 2 to 3 years?
So I think there's a couple of ways of answering that question. I think one question is to say, what is a trend, right? I think a trend is predicated on the past implicating the future. And I think while there's some of that, I think that the notion of a trend is diminishing over time, especially as we start thinking about hyperconnectivity and thinking through networks as opposed to thinking through chains and sort of linear structures. And as we start thinking through networks, the notion of a trend is limited, right? That said, I think that the technologies that we have coming along now, especially from a digital technology point of view, and I'm not going to comment on biotechnologies and things like that. I think that those are huge trends, and I think the brain initiative and understanding the brain and that direction is a huge set of technology trends that are going to have strong implications for the future. From a digital technology point of view, I think that what we're starting to see are technologies that are starting to take on human-like characteristics, and that people are starting to expect them to behave in a human-like way. And as that starts to occur, our tolerance for irregularity or our tolerance for the computation not really working is going to drop, which means that the design implications are going to go way up. So and it's going to get very hard to actually make these technologies work in a human-like way. But I think they're going to move in that direction. And I think you're going to start seeing a lot more automation of things. I think you're going to start seeing a lot of things that we think of as actually only things humans can do, as being things that computation can do. And I think the implications of that are going to be that it's going to open up entirely new spaces for human endeavor, for the kinds of things that people can and should be doing for each other, for business, right, for their societies, in ways that if we do it right, collectively, we as a society, it should make us a much better place to live and a much better place to be on the planet.
Perfect. So with every technology shift, there are trade-offs to be made. Some of the unwanted consequences could be loss of unskilled labor, for example, or manipulation of information, or even cultural shifts. How can businesses help mitigate those side effects?
Well, I think that there's a couple of answers to that question, or there's a couple of ways of thinking about it. The first is thinking about how computation addresses a loss of, say, different kinds of labor. I think it's Tom Malone, in fact, at the MIT Sloan School, who's done some work to argue that in all cases where computation or where technology has actually increased, the need for labor has actually increased overall, just not in the same kinds of jobs. And I think that puts strong implications on our education system, on our expectations of what kinds of jobs people will have on a going forward basis. And I think that's something that we need to address better as a society, as a nation in the U.S. and as a society on the world stage. I think we do have to address the role of education and the role of education with respect to, is it really only about jobs, or is it really about preparing a thinking mind, right? And what does it mean to prepare a thinking mind to be able to address new kinds of human endeavor, given that computation will take on a variety of roles? So I think that's one way of addressing the labor issue. I think all technologies actually introduce these kinds of I don't know what to even call them, these things that happen that we didn't anticipate, or things that happen that maybe some people anticipated but other people didn't believe, or these things that happen that were clearly anticipated that we chose to ignore, right? There's all kinds of a range of what does it mean to have an unwanted consequence and a cultural shift. The thing is I think it's going to happen, right? What we can learn from history, though, is that it will happen, and that we should actually be thinking about these things as we go forward. And I think that we don't, typically. We rush ahead, whether it's in industry or in society, we rush forward with the next new thing or the thing that we should be doing, and we're not paying attention, say, to the social scientists, who actually have a lot to offer in this space, right? And the social scientists need to actually engage with the industry and with the business to have these connections and to think through these kinds of cultural shifts and make choices about the directions that we want to go or not go. I think we do have the opportunity to make these choices that we didn't have in the past. Right? I think we have the opportunity because of the kinds of technologies, and I think we have the opportunity because we have a history that says when we make technology choices, we do actually have implications for society, and we should actually learn from that history and do something about it on a going forward basis, as opposed to ignoring the fact that it's actually happened and just carry on as if we don't have any history.
That makes total sense. We know that hyperconnectivity creates a lot of data, and companies use data in many different ways, and some business leaders, some people are more successful than others in using the data. What do you think is the secret ingredient of making good decisions based on data?
If you ask me, I think it's actually having a scientific mindset and a scientific outlook towards thinking about data and understanding how to use data. If you have a set of data, regardless of where those data come from, if you have a set of data, then there are limitations to that set of data. There are certain assumptions you can make and certain assumptions you can't make, right? Making good decisions with data is understanding where those data come from, understanding their reliability, understanding their validity, understanding the assumptions you can make and the ones you can't make, and then being able to use those data to actually change your mind, to make a decision that maybe goes against what you otherwise might have thought of in the absence of data, or at the very least to be able to use those data to question your own assumptions and to ask and say, well, I was really thinking this and your data are really showing that. Those are two different things. How do we actually adjudicate those two and figure out what questions should we ask to differentiate, right? So I think that if somebody's going to start making decisions based on data, they have to understand where those data are coming from, what their limitations are, and how they actually lead to better questions, right? And then on the intellectual side. On the emotional side, people have to have the strength to be able to say, the data are suggesting something that's not what I was thinking, and maybe what I was thinking wasn't right, and I should actually do something else. That's a really good scientific mindset, right? And I think having more of that is probably a good thing to have if you're going to actually use data to make decisions.
When we think about governing these new communities and setting up values that we will enforce, what is the role that businesses should be playing?
I think businesses are a part of society. I think the same premises that you actually outlined in your question with respect to communities and government and governing and society and interests are applied to businesses. I think businesses actually participate in society the same as other institutions, right? Albeit by different rules. So it's interesting if we think about a world where the connections and the connectivity and the way people actually engage with each other isn't necessarily determined by physical place, which is not. And if the rules of organization or the way that we have decided to organize ourselves as a society is largely based on geography, on physical proximity, so we have borders that are associated with geographical lines like rivers and mountains and things, or we have nation states that are defined by some, tribal relationships in some way, right? Maybe those don't need to happen anymore, right, on a going forward basis. We have reorganized our global society in the past, right? There's no reason to suggest that it won't happen again in the future. We could be intentional about it. We could think about how we actually want to organize ourselves. We could imagine such a thing, for example, as having, say, a global passport, or some people can have global passports, and we don't have to worry about nation borders as they are. Why should we bother, right? In some ways, they're really artifices of a past that maybe is going to wane in the next 100 years or so, right? I think the role of business continues to be able to create value, right, through the kinds of technologies, from a technology point of view, through the kinds of technologies, the kinds of products, the kinds of capabilities, the kinds of things that we can do to make us, to help us be better humans, right, to be better people, better members of a global society. I think businesses need to think that way. They need to think on a global basis. They need to think, what does it mean to be a global member of a society as opposed to a national entity, right? What does it mean for their customers to be able to have access to the different kinds of capabilities and products and services? And how does it make us better? I think the question we should be asking ourselves always is, how is what we're doing making us better? If it's not making us better, or if it's on balance making us worse, we should think about a new line of business.
I agree. I totally agree. Well, we're reaching the end of our interview today, and the last question I wanted to ask you, what advice do you give to MBA students who are headed out into businesses based on hyperconnectivity in order for them to make a positive impact in society? I
would ask ourselves, I think, maybe 2 or 3 questions. One question I would ask is what form of injustice are you actually resolving by participating in business? What kinds of biases are you actually removing from our society by participating in that business, right? And maybe the last question is a general one that says, what systems are we actually looking to transform, right, by the businesses that we're participating in, right? Are we maintaining an entrenched model that maybe is an extraction model of business where it's not adding value, it's a rent-seeking model, or are we actually creating value and encouraging participation and bringing people in to where we're creating a positive, forward-looking society, right? Where there's a bit of progressiveness to that, right? To remove certain forms of injustice and to remove certain kinds of biases and to create a better place.
That's perfect. Thank you so much, Tony. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.